Hello, all you people out there in YouTube land. Welcome to my lair. It's not much to look at, but it is home, at least for now. Maybe if the channel does well, I can afford to live in the sort of place Tabitha does. As you may have guessed by now, there are a few things I take issue with, the first being the art of disinformation. In my review of Depression Quest, I must admit to being a little unfair to those suffering from chronic depression, as their prognosis isn't usually all teacups and roses as I seem to have implied, but with help and the right balance of effort, therapy, and occasionally long-term medication, many of them can live happy, productive lives as members of society. We can treat many mental illnesses this way, to varying effect, depending on how well science and medicine can reason out what is going on, and can generate appropriate treatments. Bowie gave the impression that there was nothing that could be done to stabilize a depression patient, and that the best they could do was try to hold their heads up above water for as long as possible. This is simply not true. If it were, then depression on any level would be a death sentence. Many cases of depression are temporary, and as long as the sufferer has the sort of support he or she needs, then they will bounce back in days, weeks, or more rarely, months. Bowie's view of it, however, is still patently ridiculous, and not a topic for lackadaisical entertainments. If you're going to make something like this, then at least do it right, and have music that changes as the character's mood does. If I made a sufferer of chronic depression uncomfortable or made light of their circumstances, then please accept my apologies. Now that I've cleared that up, it's time to get on with what you really came for. It's Geocentric Gems Week for us, and our winner this time is a man that some in geocentric circles know well, Malcolm Bowden. He is an older British gentleman, and I am given to understand that he has some rather interesting ideas about science and the nature of society, never mind his view on which bit orbits what on larger scales. I hadn't expected this particular can of worms just yet, but Tabitha and Kage both say it's better than Eunjubi. This video is some 24 minutes long, and as tried Tabitha to do in the past, I will let Malcolm get to the point he's trying to make before I chime in to deconstruct it. This particular gem is marked the Relativity Fraud on YouTube, and I will leave a link to his original video in the description.
The Relativity Fraud. Established by trickery, maintained by propaganda. A simple exposure for laymen. By Malcolm Bowden.
That's quite the title, Malcolm. You make a rather bold claim, even if you are trying to textbook your information to such a degree that even those in scholastically impaired backwaters of society will understand your absolute brilliance. I eagerly await your evidence.
In 1887, an experiment shattered the scientific community.
You're right about that. The Michelson-Morley experiment's null result was a rather large spike in the heart of the ether hypothesis. The motion they detected in the apparatus wasn't anywhere near expected values.
Michelson and Morley tried to check the speed of the Earth through the ether as it orbited the Sun by passing light in two directions, one in the direction of the Earth's travel and one at right angles, and then comparing them for differences. They expected to measure a speed of about 30 kilometers per second. To their amazement, there was no movement of this order. They called it a null result. They actually measured 1 to 10 kilometers per second, but it was still called a null result.
Yes, because the expected values were anticipated as a sine wave, and this didn't happen. 1 to 10 kilometers per second of motion in a jerky sort of almost flat line would generally suggest either a flawed experiment, or an incorrect premise that leads to an unexpected conclusion. I see here that your diagram shows the apparatus vertical to the surface, and rotating Terra orbiting Sol, as it does. Carry on, then.
They rushed out the theory called the Fitzgerald-Lorentz contraction. This claimed that the tube in line with the direction of movement shortens as it moves through the ether. There was no evidence whatsoever for this. It was only a way of getting over the implication that the Earth was stationary.
The implication that the Earth was stationary. You're going to need more than a null result, an ad hoc hypothesis, and a couple of silver candlesticks to convince me that what you just said has anything to do with it. In fact, you're positing criminal levels of collusion in the scientific community of the day. Given what I know of that time period, what you suggest is extremely unlikely.
Later in 1905 and 1915, Einstein produced his relativity theories, which overcame the troublesome Michelson-Morley experiment by simply abolishing the ether. The whole theory is riddled with contradictions and problems, which we will examine.
I will be very interested in seeing your evidence for all of this.
Before we do so, we will examine a fundamental contradiction in the theory, which will arise several times in various subjects that we deal with. This is known as the clock, or twins paradox. It totally destroys the whole basis on which the theory is founded.
We're going to be doing a lot of this, aren't we? You make a flamboyant claim, and then refuse to back it up, followed by me calling you on it.
Imagine a clock on the Earth and an identical one on a rocket. According to relativity, if the rocket goes into space and later returns, its clock will run slower than the Earth clock.
I have a question. Are you referring to special relativity, or general relativity? They're very different things, even if they are interconnected.
However, as far as the person on the rocket is concerned, it is the Earth that is rushing away from the rocket. Acceleration is not accounted for in relativity, and according to relativity, the rocket can claim that it is the Earth that is moving. Now, if it is considered that the Earth is moving, then its clock will be slower than the rocket's clock. But a clock cannot be both slower and faster than another clock, which is a complete contradiction. So the clock paradox, which is inherent in the theory, actually destroys its validity.
That's silly. They're in completely different inertial frames. The twin on the rocket moves out in one frame, and back in another. You've oversimplified this thought experiment, and decided to leave off the solution. We have in fact observed these phenomena in action using atomic clocks in aircraft and satellites, as you will admit later, and then try and besmirch. The GPS in your car wouldn't operate if what you say is true, because the technology was designed on this particular bit of science.
We will not set out the various claims and effects of relativity, but we will first look at 4 evidences said to support the theory.
4 bits of evidence in support of. This is going to be fun, if it's anything like your last attempt.
The experiment that was said to confirm relativity and made Einstein famous was the Eclipse experiment of 1919. As starlight passes the Sun, it is slightly bent. Newton said it would be 0.9 arc seconds. Einstein said it would be twice that, 1.8 arc seconds. Check plates of 7 stars were taken at night and then compared with the same stars taken when the Sun was in eclipse, and the stars could be seen for a while as their light came past the Sun. But there are many problems with this experiment. Firstly, they used a mirror to reflect the light into a horizontal telescope. This introduced 3 times the error the direct use of a telescope gives. Secondly, the heat of the Sun on the mirror warps it and introduces further errors into the readings. Thirdly, as the cone of darkness crosses the Earth, it causes considerable turbulence in the atmosphere due to the change of temperature, which plays havoc with the star's images. Finally, the starlight comes in at an angle, and the Earth's atmosphere bends the starlight, which has to be corrected. But this correction is 100 times the minute angle change that they were looking for. Here are the results of plotting of two of the stars, and how chaotic they are can be seen. To be convincing, all the check star plots, they are the green crosses, should be close together, and the eclipse star plots, the red stars, should also be close together, but you can see how almost random they are. C. Will, although a convinced relativist, nevertheless admitted in an Einstein centenary survey in 1979 that these results were very meagre and would not have been accepted as proofs today. They were 1. Explicable by other means. The results were from half to twice the predicted value, and they had only 30% accuracy. Such a condemnation renders the eclipse results useless as a proof of relativity. Yet they were announced as convincing in 1919.
I have a couple of comments before you go on, Malcolm, starting with your estimates of bending of light through the atmosphere, as well as warping in the mirror they used. You provide no mathematics for this, but another diagram of unknown provenance, assuming your version of events is correct, of course. I haven't found a diagram of it beyond the one you provided in the video. It sounds to me like they may have used a mirror so they weren't directly observing Sol, but more likely you refer to the mirror that resided within the telescope, rather than an external one that you would prefer. There were criticisms of Eddington's results, but a study in 1979 of his photos shows that he was correct. Certainly, they didn't have what we would consider modern equipment. Also, one statement from one unidentifiable individual is only proof if you're writing a Bible. Way to cherry-pick, Malcolm. I begin to see why most of your detractors feel the need to use colorful vernacular when dealing with you. Sad part is that we're only 6 minutes in.
An alternative explanation of the eclipse results. Professor Poor showed that a thin amount of matter around the Sun could account for the deflections, and we will be referring to this later when dealing with the precession of Mercury's perihelion. This was considered by the relativists, but was blankly dismissed by them. Why? It is perfectly possible for there to be a small amount of material around the Sun, but this was not the explanation they wanted.
Doesn't matter what they wanted. Poor Professor Poor would have needed to show the existence of such a thing before it would be accepted. Occam's razor says that all things being equal, the simplest explanation is most likely the best one. A small amount of matter would likely have been seen, if there were enough of it to make a difference, or was a great despiser of Einstein, as it seems you are.
The flying clocks experiment. 4 atomic clocks were flown eastward and then westward. It was claimed that the results supported relativity. However, there is the same objection to the clock's paradox. In relativity, you cannot choose one clock as a standard. All clocks are the same relative to each other. Many clocks at different latitudes are moving at different speeds, but no differences due to this have ever been recorded. The paper indicates that there was a similar experiment carried out in 1970, but these do not seem to have been reported. As with the eclipse results, experiments are repeated until the required results can be massaged out of the chaotic readings.
I answered number 1 already, so I won't do so again now. Number 2 is only vaguely more interesting, because even if your assertion is true, the variance would be measured in Planck time for an annoyingly long period. However, unless I'm badly mistaken, the Earth rotates at the same rate at all latitudes. Some drivel about it being a solid or something. As for number 3, you're forwarding a conspiracy that couldn't have happened. Let me give you a bit of a tip here, Malcolm. The safety of a secret is inversely proportional to the number of people that know it. You're talking about millions of people that would have to know, and that would never work. Here again, Occam's razor loves you, young Master Bowden. Have you learned to shave yet?
Essen an expert pointed out that not all the results had been used. If they had been included, then the results would become westbound 275 in theory, but reported was 205. The correct figure should have been 134. And the correct figure over the theoretical figure is only 0.49. In the eastbound, 40 was in theory, only 66 were reported, but the correct figure should have been 132. This gives a ratio of the correct figure over the theoretical figure of 3.3. As can be seen, the correct values are half and over 3 times the expected values. Hardly convincing proof. Hathaway, one of the experimenters, admitted, "The difference between theory and measurement is disturbing." This was omitted from the report, which said the results were convincing qualitative results.
May I see your mathematics? There is likely a reason the other clocks were not initially included. They could have been backups, controls, broken in transit, or what have you. You don't get to make up maths and then tout them about as proof that you're right.
Kelly examined the original papers and claimed that the clocks would have to be 100 times more accurate than they were to prove their case. Many corrections were applied, and one clock was corrected from 26 to 266 without any explanation. Clearly, this proof of relativity, like the Eclipse experiment, is quite worthless, yet it is still paraded as convincing evidence. As with the Eclipse results, the very small values needed to support relativity had to be massaged out of the wildly varying values recorded. Upon such thin evidence was relativity thrust upon the scientific world with a huge propaganda campaign that tried to intimidate any scientist that dared to oppose it. It was very successful, but not totally so.
I don't know who Kelly is, either, and you give no references for any of this, with your wild accusations of collusion to date. In the lack of anything I can look at, I must assume that you're being dishonest. The only thing being massaged at this point is your overgrown sense of self-worth, and it seems you're capable of handling that task with one hand whilst using the other to write word salad to annoy people that are capable of catching you out.
The precession of Mercury's perihelion. Mercury orbits the Sun in an elliptical orbit, and the long axis slowly rotates with each orbit. It rotates at 5,600 arc-seconds per century. But although astronomers could account for most of this rotation, there was a remaining 43 arc-seconds they could not account for. Einstein boasted that this unexplained 43 seconds of arc per century was explained by his theory, against which classical mechanics was powerless. Yet no less than 4 classical explanations were provided. Charles Poor found that if there were a small amount of material around the Sun, this would fully explain the 43 seconds. In addition, this gave exactly the same deflection results that relativists were looking for in the Eclipse experiments. Thus, this one assumption solved 2 problems without using relativity.
You missed something here, Malcolm, and now it's time to call you out on it. If we were dealing with a local phenomenon, then it would have other effects we could see easily. As for the other half of this assumption, that would explain light bending around Sol, but not all the other stars.
Secondly, the small bulge of the Sun's equator causes this precession almost exactly. Thirdly, in 1898, Gerber accounted for the precession by assuming that gravity propagated at the speed of light. And fourthly, Moon, using the mass of the stars, known as Mach's principle, also obtained the same result as Einstein.
That bulge is caused by the other planets pulling on it. We have one here too. How this explains anything is unknown to me. Gerber's assumption is exactly that, an assumption. Just as you can't make assertions without the need for evidence, without evidence, Gerber would gave gotten exactly nowhere. Moon misused Mac the same way you like to, by conflating causes and influences. These words are not synonyms, and are likely very offended that you do that to them.
Even today, relativists claim that only relativity can explain certain observed phenomena, and therefore it confirms that relativity is true. But, in every case, there is a classical explanation that is never referred to and receives little or no publicity. So relativists continue in their self-contained world of continual denial of alternative explanations. In 1859, Fizeau found that light was deflected by flowing water. Einstein claimed, yet again, that the classical explanation does not in the least diminish the conclusiveness of the experiment as a crucial test in favour of the theory of relativity. Poor's comments upon this statement are scathing. These two sentences should be read and reread. How can an experiment equally well explained by several different theories be a crucial test in favour of one of them? Einstein's claim is typical of relativists' arrogance.
Just about halfway now, and I have to ask, what is a relativist in this context? You make it sound like an epithet. I'm still waiting for your maths, Mr. Bowden. I'm rapidly coming to the conclusion that you don't have any that aren't marked in your twee little diagrams.
Muons. These are short-life, high-velocity particles that should have disintegrated before they reach the Earth's surface. As relativity predicts that moving clocks are slower, this is held as a further proof. But Setterfield and Barnes have shown, independent of relativity, that their life can be longer due to their speed. In addition, the Earth can be considered as rushing towards them, according to relativity theory, and we have the same contradiction as in the clocks.
We've already dealt with this, Malcolm. The twin paradox isn't a paradox any more than you're a professional footballer.
Paradox. Contrary experiments. Michelson-Morley and Miller. We have shown how the Michelson-Morley null result was the real reason why Einstein abolished the ether. But it was not a null result, for speeds of up to 10 kilometers per second were recorded by Miller, who continued with a similar apparatus studying these results for the rest of his life. These results greatly troubled Einstein, because if there were no ether, they should have all been zero. Shankland, who had worked with Miller, had an interview with Einstein, which greatly enhanced his prestige. After Miller's death, he wrote an article very critical of Miller's experiments, claiming that his positive results were due to his inadequate control of the temperature of the arms, which was completely false. He went on to rise to high positions in his profession.
We covered this up front as well. This information should have been in with that. Einstein didn't abolish the ether, it never existed in the first place. From that, all else follows.
Sagnac. Sagnac passed a light both ways around a revolving table and found that the fringe changes corresponded with the speed of rotation. This proved that there was an ether, contradicting relativity. The light was travelling through the ether at a fixed rate. The mirrors, going with or against the direction of the light, gave the interference fringe changes he recorded. Modern laser compasses use this effect today. To deny that the ether exists is nonsense.
Sagnac looks entirely like a variation of Michelson-Morley. If someone has real science to back up Malcolm, I would appreciate seeing it. Also, since we're at it, you can explain away Einstein's field equations. There's a nice boy.
Einstein. What sort of a man was he? My lever. His first wife, Mileva, bore him an illegitimate daughter, which Einstein immediately had adopted without ever seeing the child. It is thought that Mileva, a bright student, may have been the brains behind relativity, because after she left him taking their 2 boys, he never made any further notable advances in physics for the rest of his life. He also gave her the full amount of his Nobel Prize. Was this hush money?
That was what he agreed to pay her to obtain a divorce. If this series of ad hominem attacks is all you've got left, I'm going to have to be upset.
Was Einstein a plagiarist? He, first of all, rediscovered Lorentz's 1904 transformations. Secondly, he developed statistical mechanics and molecular kinetic theory, unaware of Boltzmann and Gibbs' major treatise. Thirdly, Poincaré worked on relativity and Brownian motion, 2 subjects that Einstein later became famous for. Was there a mole in Poincaré's staff? 4. Mandel told Einstein that one of his papers was not new, as it was all found in a paper by Klein. Fifthly, Einstein, having seen a paper by de Broglie, referred to the contents in a lecture in September 1924, 2 months before de Broglie's paper was published, without giving him any credit. The subject was the start of quantum mechanics and wave theory. Pays, Einstein's biographer, says he was the godfather of wave mechanics.
Again with the ad hominem. All of Einstein's work was based in part on the work of others all the way back to Galileo, Brahe, Kepler and Newton.
And finally, E equals mc squared. Einstein did not discover this formula. Poincaré had been working on mass, energy, light and relativity and submitted his paper on the 5th of June 1905. Einstein submitted his paper on the 30th of June 1905. Did he know of Poincaré's paper anyway? It is Einstein's paper that received all the publicity. The link between E, M and C was well known by many physicists in 1905 and is embedded in Maxwell's equations. In fact, the power of the atom and that it was related to the square of the speed of light was noted in a paper by Preston as early as 1875. Nevertheless, Einstein has always been credited with the discovery of E equals mc squared. That this formula is correct has absolutely nothing to do with relativity, yet it is implied that because it is true and the atom bomb works, then relativity must be true, which is nonsense.
Source, please.
Comments by scientists. Rutherford treated the theory as a joke. He walked out of the 1919 Eclipse meeting immediately after the President's introduction. When asked why no Anglo-Saxon understood relativity, he replied, "No, they have too much sense." Soddy considered it a swindle. Sir Oliver Lodge, Max Born, Ernest Mach, Poincaré, Pauli, Poor and Lorenz all rejected the theory. Ashton points out that in 2 separate papers, Einstein contradicts himself. In one, he suggests that slow acceleration of the electron may not give off energy. But what is the border speed between giving off energy and not?
You have a laundry list of detractors, and I'm bored. Find me a scientific theory that has no detractors, and I'll show you a theory that hasn't been discussed yet.
Professor Dingle initially lectured on relativity, but began to question the theory, particularly the clock paradox. He began seeking answers, but found that he was shunned by former friends and colleagues. Failing to get a hearing, he wrote Science at the Crossroads, in which he realized that science had departed from its pursuit of truth. Professor Essen was so persistently critical of relativity that he was warned by those in power that his promotion prospects and therefore his pension were threatened. He is not the only one to find that opposition to relativity and evolution can damage your career prospects. Today, so accepted is the theory that few are prepared to risk their careers by criticizing it. Relativists and evolutionists dominate the mass media, and criticisms thereby are muted and ignored.
Number 5 needs a source, and number 6 is another anecdote with your rather strange ideas of a major scientific conspiracy. Why haven't they shut me up yet?
The anti-Christian modern propaganda. The question that must be addressed is, why should anyone want to impose relativity upon the scientific community, knowing it to be false? To answer this, we have to take a broad view of modern concepts, of which relativity is but one, and it becomes obvious that they are all fundamentally anti-Christian. 1. Lyell deliberately set out to destroy the Mosaic account of creation and the flood by presenting false evidence of strata taking millions of years to be laid down. 2. Darwin and his successors claimed that all life evolved by chance, and that man was only a clever ape, not a creation of God for a purpose. He also prepared people to accept huge changes as part of the process of evolution. Freud swept aside any sense of guilt and allowed people to blame their parents or their circumstances for their sins. Marx, ignoring the existence of man's original sin, beguiled millions by promising a heaven on earth, but drew them into a cruel slavery controlled by an elite. 5. Postmodernism says that there is no absolute certainty or truth in life. Every person's view of life is as valid as everyone else's. And 6. Einstein said, there is no center of stability. Each unit, i.e. person, is on its own. It also enabled theoreticians to dictate how scientists should interpret their cosmological experiments. All these intelligent and educated men are unwittingly playing the part of Lenin's useful idiots in Satan's warfare against God's people. The Christian replies. 1. The earth is about 6,000 years old, and the fossils were all laid down in one worldwide flood, as set out in the Bible. 2. There is no evidence of one species evolving into a completely different species. God created them in major groups that could only vary within a limited range. Man was God's special creation in his image. 3. Freud tried to remove any sense of guilt from man, but we still all instinctively know that we are rebels against a holy God. 4. Marx tried to crush the church, but Christians looked not for a heaven on earth, but to that true heaven in eternity. 5th, there is ultimate truth as revealed in the Bible. All men will finally be judged by these standards that he has set before us. And 6th, this earth is at the center of God's interest, because it is the only place where he has placed life and man, his special creation. Therefore, he has made it the center of the universe, for it is only on this planet that he is playing out what I call the drama of the universe, and nowhere else. And finally, a thought for the viewer. Only in the Christian faith can man find peace with God, stability, significance, and security, despite an increasingly chaotic and dangerous world. Christ claimed to be God, so he was either mad, bad, or God. What is your decision?
You spent the last several minutes impugning the names of some of the greatest thinkers ever to exist, and although some of the things they did were turned to unseemly ends, they did not have coming the treatment you gave them. You wrap up by giving Christian statements about these people, most of which are false outright, and the rest concocted from whole cloth. As far as your final thought to the viewer, I posit that your question is malformed. If you give one of those answers, you must by definition admit that Jesus existed exactly as described. So I will proffer a fourth option, non-existent. The next slide has you pitching your book as if this is merely a teaser. Given what I've seen here, I won't be getting that book, nor will I recommend it to my viewers. I will instead send you to bed with a text on astronomy, with orders that you read it and respond with that breakdown of maths for Einstein's field equations. Of course, you're more likely to ignore this video altogether, as you did more ASILAs on the subject from a month or so ago, or do what you did to CoolHardLogic and pick apart something in my first 2 minutes that has nothing to do with the topic at hand, but still needed said. Because unlike some people, I'm happy to admit my mistakes, and do my best to correct them as they come to my attention. It's a little thing called intellectual honesty, and that, sir, is something you need to stock up on. For the people that stayed with this video this long, this week's shout out goes to Robin Dupree Reed, a very funny lady that gives out a weekly award or 3 to the most inane YouTubers we can find. Stop by her channel for fun defucktardery Friday, have a giggle, and find out who Big Red is going to visit next week. If you like what you see, please don't forget to rate, comment, and subscribe. Then rummage through the links under the description. I'll be back later in the week with another rant of some sort, and a review of Gone Home. I haven't played it yet, but from what I've heard, it should at least be better than Depression Quest. Until then, fair skies and good debunking.